Hello, my name is Matthew Marquit and welcome to this second video of a beginner's guide to Substance Painter. In this particular video I want to focus on the basic interface of Substance Painter and how it relates to your workflow, and have a stronger focus on the viewports and kind of how you see things within the video, because a lot of the interface items I will actually cover in more depth in different videos. So let's get started. So we see over here that I created an image. I do actually have some numbers in here that are relative to what different parts of the UI are. And I'll talk about each one. The first, and so we're going to talk a little bit about this. I'm going to skip over here into Substance Painter, but we'll see. I mean, obviously I didn't talk about this, but we do know that in any particular program, you always have your drop-down menu. So there they are, they exist, and you can find options up there. But this section right here is called your toolbar, and the toolbar actually has a whole bunch of kind of mini toolbars within it. So you can kind of see right here that I can like pull off this toolbar, and I could, I mean, feasibly put it anywhere I want. I'm not sure why I'd want to, but you could do that. You can move them around. If you actually see a little tick mark next to it, you can hold it down and actually choose a different tool. So there's multiple tools, kind of like you would see in Photoshop's toolbar. Okay, and then the way you can turn them on and off, especially if you don't use a lot of them, is you go up to View, go to Toolbars, and you see right now they're all turned on, but let's just say I shut off Tools, then I'll lose all those tools that were right there. So we can go back, View, Toolbars, and then turn them back on. Okay, so those are the bunch of options that you have. Now, just to say what they are real quick, here's your Substance Share and Substance Source links. I'll cover those in a different video. Your paintbrush, your eraser tool, your projection, and by the way, as I'm saying this, if you ever hover over anything, it will give you the name of what it is, but you can see right here, projection. This would be your polygon fill, your smudge tool, your clone tools that are going on here, your material picker. This is your symmetry tools. This is your 2D and 3D toggles as far as the viewports are concerned. This right here is your constrain rotation tool. You do have your perspective versus orthographic view tool, your rendering tool, which we're not going to get into at all in any of my videos. So if you want to learn about that, you do have to look that up separately, but it's just not completely related to game development. It's only more of like an artist thing if they want to do their portfolio piece or so on. Your lazy mouse tool. You have export to Photoshop, and then you have your resource updater kind of manager button. So most of these I won't cover. I'll only get back to a couple of them over here that are related to the viewports in a moment. So we'll start off by then switching down to the viewports, which, as I've mentioned several times, exist here. Of course, you can always expand these windows, make them bigger, make more, make things easier to see by moving stuff around. But this is your 3D viewport, clearly, as we can see here, and this is our 2D kind of texture viewport right over here. Now you can make it so that one or the other exist at any given point. So right here, if you actually hit F1, and this is the hotkey, or just click this button, it will show you both. F2 is to only show 3D, and then F3 is to only show the 2D. But if I hit back and go F1 again, we'll get our two views. Okay, so it's up to you how you want to do that. I know a lot of people only work in the 3D mode. They're just so used to painting directly on the texture, and that's fine, or the model I should say, and that's how that works, by the way. You can paint directly onto the object. Here, if I say I have the blade selected, I make a new layer, you see I can come up in here and just kind of paint on it. So you can literally paint directly on it, which is really the power, of course, of Substance Painter. Okay, and obviously you can also paint directly on the texture and see it show up over here, and they both update in real time. Okay, now the next thing, and like I said, we'll hit these a little bit more in a bit, but the next thing I want to talk about is the shelf. So the shelf is where all the content is. I'll have a whole video on the shelf, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but basically, this is where you'll find the prefabs, the prefabs that they make from Algorithmic that you can use, or any content you want to import. So if you want to import content, you can do that, and you can see there's a whole ton of categories. Okay, you can actually also see down here, if you click on log, you can see that they'll show you the log in the background. So if something's not, working right, or you're getting an error, you can go check it over here in the log. All right. Now, if we're moving over here, we'll see layers, and layers, once again, another video, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but just imagine Photoshop and you understand layers. This is really almost identical. There are a couple of things that, of course, are unique to Substance Painter, and we'll cover those in that video, but we'll just skip that for now. Now we see over here the texture set lists. So remember when I told you guys in the other video that if you add separate materials to your object before you export it, this is what's going to happen. You're going to have a different sets of textures. And and you'll see right here that I can click on the handle and the runes and whatever. And this is all based off of what materials I assigned when I was in 3D Studio Max, and the names are based off what I gave the material a name within Max also. So keep that in mind. And you can even shut them on and off, and you'll see that they'll shut on and off within the viewport. So that's one of the cool things about having a texture set. But like I said, the downside, of course, is now I literally have 4 sets of textures that will export for one item, and that's a little bit kind of on, on the low end of the spectrum as far as optimization is concerned. We really don't want to have that many textures, as a lot of this blank space will be useless. However, if for some reason you're using the entirety of each one of these, so it's unwrapped in a way that the entirety of just the runes fills this up and just the stem fills this up and so on, then that would be fine. That would be an ideal situation. So some very complex, characters or, larger, kind of models or more complex models, that would then make sense. But on a small item like this, not so much. Material ID is for the win as far as smaller items go. Of course, even though I did this over here, but I did this just to kind of show you guys the process. Okay, so and then you'll notice that as I switch these, you'll see the layers will update because yes, they are fully different textures, so layers will change. And the other thing you'll notice that will change will be the texture set settings down here, which whatever the settings for each one of these items are, they will show up down here. So these are the maps assigned to each of the texture sets within the list. You'll actually see them change as I update. So let me click on runes and you'll see the update down here and they'll change. In fact, I was fooling around with this and I even added an emissive channel to this one, even though it doesn't need it. We can shut that off by hitting the minus button. But these images or these different texture types and channels that we see up here that are set within the texture settings or texture set settings, these are set by your initial profile when you first start. So I chose Unreal 4. That's why I'm getting a base color, a height, a roughness, a metallic, and a normal. If I needed any other type of channel, I can always hit the plus over here and add them. So as I was showing before, when I had the emissive, you can literally click on this, boom, and there you go. You've got your emissive channel. You can fool around with that or delete it. Okay, and any of the assigned maps, and these maps were assigned when I baked them out. I don't have any vertex coloring on it, so it didn't do the ID. If I brought in the other one, this ID channel would have been supplied. Okay, and I guess we're getting a little bit of news down here, so boop, we'll shut that off. All right. So the other thing that you can do down here too is you can set the size of your textures. I mean, theoretically, you can click on this and change them so that they're not the same. They're not a square. It'll be more like a rectangle. I'm not sure why you might want to do that, but I suppose maybe some of you guys can find reasons to do that. There are some other things down here that I'm not really going to get into, but we did talk about baking textures in the other video. And then, of course, if you want to change any of these out in real time, let's just say you have a different map you definitely want to switch it out with. Maybe I did make an ID map in a different program. You can just click on here and select any of the textures that are within the project. So anything you would find under the texture section of the shelf will show up here, and you can choose to put them within that. Or you can just replace any of these. It doesn't even have to be blank. Okay, but like I said, these were just automatically populated when I baked out the textures. Okay, so that's what your texture set settings do. Now if we go over here, we can see that there is a display settings section. This I will cover in just a little bit when we get back to our viewports. And then the same thing can be said about viewer settings, which I will also cover in a little bit when we get back to viewports. So the last thing I did want to talk about, obviously, before we get to those is the property section, because that's all that is left. And you'll see that the property section is basically context sensitive. So if I select something and there's properties I can change about it, this will update. So you can see when I choose different layers, this will update to match the layer or whatever that thing is. If it's a fill layer, if it's a filter, if it's a mask, this kind of stuff will change and update over here. The same can be said as I choose things over here in the shelf and so on. So if I say choose a brush in the shelf, I can also get, especially if let me click off of this for a moment here, but you can see if I change this, you'll see in the shelf, I will get different updates to my brush. I will cover how to do a lot of these settings or how to change some of these settings in future videos. Okay, so there you go. There is your basic interface as far as this program is concerned. But let's learn and, like I said, focus on a little bit more about these viewports themselves. So how do we move around? Well, the first thing is Alt is your best friend when it comes to moving around in the 3D viewport or 2D actually. If you hold down Alt and you press the left mouse, you can kind of rotate the camera. If you press the middle mouse button down, you can kind of pan the camera. And if you press the right mouse button down, and this is with Alt for all three of them, you can do a nice smooth dolly. Now, technically speaking, you use the mouse wheel to scroll in and out, but it kind of pops. If you hold down Alt with the right mouse, you'll get a smoother view. Now, the same could be said about this view. You don't even have to click it. You just hover it over and it'll start working. So mouse wheel will scroll in and out. Alt and left mouse will rotate the texture, which is actually fairly useful, especially if you're using something like a Wacom tablet, where your arm angle is easier to draw. So if you're one of those people that want to draw on the texture and you want to get that line perfect, you can do that without even having to rotate the Wacom itself. You can just rotate the texture in here. Now, if you add shift to it, and this actually works in the 3D view too, you can actually rotate it 90 degrees. So you see how I can rotate this and get it back to kind of snap to a 90-degree angle. If I hold down Alt and middle mouse, I can pan, and then Alt and the right mouse button, I can kind of zoom in and out. Okay, now the thing about these viewports are you can paint on them right live. So if I paint on, I'm on the X blade up here and I paint on this blank layer, I can then add a texture to the top of it this way. Of course, I can paint on the texture over here and it'll update also in there. Okay, so that's how it works. They're always live, they're always updating. And as I mentioned before, when you rotate, if you add Alt and Shift together plus the left mouse button you're rotating, you can actually snap it to different views, right? And this is kind of cool too. So you can use that to kind of paint on a more top view. But remember, this is by default, this is going to be perspective. If you want that perfect orthographic view, like that top-down, no perspective view, like you would see like in a floor plan or in a UV itself, things like that. In order to do that, that's actually the tools you find up here, which we can go from F5, which is perspective view, to F6, which is orthographic view. Now we know in orthographic view that we are the dead set top, right? And so we can kind of paint on that with no perspective. And then if we rotate the camera using Alt, Shift, and left mouse button, right, just hold it down, we can rotate it and we'll stay in these orthographic views. Okay, but if we want to switch back to a perspective, we're going to use the hotkey F5 or just click it up here and it'll go back to perspective. Okay, so those are some of the hotkeys. So I'm going to switch over to my notes here to make sure that I'm covering everything I want to talk to. So we talked about, we can paint directly on, they're updating real time. Also, actually, which I forgot to mention, if you hold down the any of the hotkeys here, right, you'll actually get this little pop-up. Okay, so if I hold down Alt, I'll get a pop-up that shows me anything related to Alt. Say, same thing with Control, same thing with Shift, any of the buttons, right? If I press S, anything related to S. So any button that you push, it will show. That's kind of cool. It just gives you the hotkeys. If you don't like it, of course, you can always go to Edit, Settings, and we could shut it off by coming over here where it says Show Keyboard Helper. You shut that off. I kind of like it, but if you don't want it, you can shut it off there. You can even shut off the axis, the world axis in the corner of these views. I'm not sure why you'd want to, but you can do that. The background color can also be swapped out. So right now it's like this light gray to dark gray fade. So if you want to change that to a blue, you can have it fade from the blue down to the dark gray or a different color. You swap them there. I'm not going to do that because there's actually no way to default it back. So I'm just going to leave that alone. So yeah, be careful of that when you go to switch it. You kind of remember the last color so you don't freak it out. The other thing too is when I'm rotating around the object or zooming or using the mouse wheel, all those kind of things, this can be controlled by your camera options section. So we can go in here and scroll it so it spins faster, zooms faster, kind of moves faster. So all of that, you can play around with that. And then you have some other options down here that if you want to explore, you're more than welcome to. The shortcut one is actually kind of cool too now that we're in here. This way, especially if you don't want the shortcut helper in the corner, you can actually see every shortcut within Substance Painter, and you can even change them if you want. So if you want to press a button other than Tab to make it hide the UI, you're more than welcome to swap it out by pressing that, but I'm just going to leave that. Okay, the rest of the stuff, like the shelf stuff, you can look up in your own time. So I'll hit OK, and there you go. So once again, a couple of cool things about that. Like I said, you do see those icons. But speaking of hotkeys, there are a couple of other fun hotkeys when it comes to these viewports, and one of them is C. So if you press C, you actually jump to Channel View. So now I'm only going to see my color or my diffuse channel. If I hit C again, it will switch to the height map and you'll see it listed up here, right? Then I'll go to roughness and metallic. And so as many channels as you have, you'll be able to kind of bounce around between them, right, as you go through that. Now, if you want to get back to your normal view or your material view, you just hit M. So that is the hotkey to go back to material view, and you'll get your lighting again. And speaking of lighting, okay, and then we'll talk about that. If you hold it down Shift and you use, whoops, I'm going to try that again. Actually, let me double check because I don't do this a lot and I don't want to look silly. right here. So shift and right mouse button. I was pressing shift and left. So shift and right mouse button will actually rotate the lighting in the scene. So that's pretty cool, pretty fun to deal with. Okay, and speaking of which, again, when we get into lighting, let's start talking about some of these settings over here. So the first one, I'm actually going to jump over to the viewer settings first, and then we'll hit up the display settings. Sorry. So by default, you can set the kind of mode over here too. So you can even do solo and then show just those maps like I showed before by switching it over there, right? Or we can just come back over here and set it to M or material. The environment map is what is controlling the lighting. So if you click on this, you actually have all these different environment maps to choose. So if I select a different one, you'll actually see the lighting will change. Now, there actually is a background too, but by default it's hidden. The opacity is initially set to 0 on the background. So if you actually move this bar up, and we go all the way up to 100, we can see the background. So now I can rotate around and kind of see whatever background is creating this lighting. Okay, if you want, you can leave it and then maybe make it brighter. I don't know why you'd want to do that, but you could. So just leave it at 0. You can rotate it also this way. So instead of just holding down shift and right mouse button, you can move this. Then you have your environment blur. So if you kind of like the colors, but you don't want to see the detail because it's kind of making it hard to see what you're doing, you can just blur it out and it gives you kind of a nice sense there. Personally, I don't ever use this, and I know most people don't, but if you think that's good, you want to try it out, go ahead. Might look good in renders and other things too. Right, but like I said, there you go. There's your opacity and things like that. Now you can also turn on shadows. So I usually don't work with shadows, especially if the scene is some heavy lighting. But if you want and just want to get a little bit of a better sense of the shadow, you can play with the opacity here too. Like you can drop the shadows down, and this doesn't affect the actual end result because you can see the texture isn't updating over there. This is just kind of a visual thing in the viewport. So you're not actually controlling any shadows on the actual model. You're just controlling the shadows within the viewport. But I'm going to shut those off. Okay, there's other things that you can change here, but I'm not going to get into them mostly because I don't really know what they do. That would kind of make sense not to fool around with something I don't know what it is. But then you also have over here, you have your shader section to choose from. So this should be set when you choose your template, but you can change them later. So things like if you want to do like something that has an opacity channel, you're going to need to choose one of these over here, right? There's kind of like a translucent one and more of a masked type template. I'm not going to change it, but there are different templates that will give you different effects, okay, so or different shaders in general, but this one's your metallic roughness physically based rendering material. Okay, then you'll see that there's all sorts of other parameters in here. I mean, we have, once again, and I'm not really going to get into them, but you'll see there is a ton of different parameters we can play with as far as the shader is concerned. When you play with the stencil, if you go to use the stencil, that's up there. Or the projection tool, you can play around with that. You also will see too, if I expand this out again, you'll see a wireframe mode, so you can turn the wireframe mode on. You can change the color of the wireframe, the opacity of it, so if you want to leave the wireframe on while you're working for some reason, you can do that. And I believe it affects the polygon fill also, so if I have the polygon fill turned on, let's see, I'll try it. Yeah, so it does. So it does affect that tool also. All right, so I'll just switch it back to the paintbrush, and we'll shut off wireframe. Okay. So anyways, you can see that. Now there's other ones, so there's other common parameters, so you can play around with the ambient occlusion. So if your map has an ambient occlusion, you can have it, more intensified. The height force, so basically, the height map that you have on it, how much is it really making it pop out? You can go in here and play around with this. Okay. There's lots of other things. The quality, this is by default set to low. But if you want, you can move it high. If you have a really good computer, you can go higher with things. So this is all the different passes, so it just looks better. Just be mindful that some of this stuff is irrelevant when it comes to actual game work, because while it might make it look cool within this viewport, all that matters is what it looks like in the end result. So whether it be Unreal, Unity, or some other program that you're using, that's what matters. So just be careful about getting too hung up on moving some of these things around and getting something super pretty, because it's going to make it, not necessarily look the same when you switch over to the the game engine of choice. And then there's some parallax occlusion mapping options too, but whatever. Okay, so you get the idea. So this is what viewer setting does. And then this last one here that I kind of wanted to talk about is your display settings. I don't want to put a lot of focus on this one, but this one is more of a rendering thing too. You can change your field of view in here, your focus distance, stuff like that, the aperture of the camera, and you can activate post effects. So I can turn this on, and then I can do things like add a glare glare to the scene, and then you can see right there, even when you can see the lighting on the metal, it just kind of pops like crazy. I mean, while it looks cool, once again, this really doesn't affect your texture in any way. So this is up to you if you want to do that. A vignette, if you want to add like a kind of like a light, you can kind of see a very light fade in the corners when you do that. You can play with the settings if you expand it and do more, but I'm not really going to get into it because once again, this is another one of those things that if you really want to learn it, go ahead and learn it in your own time. It's not as relevant, but just know that those tools are there. So I'm pretty sure I covered everything I wanted to talk about. I'm just double check by taking a look at my notes here. But of course, we covered the toolbars and each one of the tools. I spent a little bit of time making sure that we talked about some of these. Now, I didn't go over to mode switch. There is an edit mode versus rendering mode. Don't make the mistake of clicking rendering mode by, if you're like in the middle of doing something, you haven't saved it, because it will just start rendering automatically. So we're going to not do that. I did show you the 2D, 3D viewport toggles and the camera toggle. I didn't show the camera rotation toggle, but it's right next to the orthographic switch. So it's this one right here. So you can do free rotation, which is actually a little crazier. So this one kind of goes flying all over the place. I'm not a huge fan of that. And then you have, of course, whoops, I clicked on the wrong one. If you click back on this, you go back to constrained rotation. That's a little bit better. If you want to center your object, let's say you moved your object, I forgot to say this, hit F, and that will kind of frame it or focus it is what the real term is meant. And this is getting crazy with this glare stuff. It does look kind of cool, but like I said, a little silly because it really doesn't represent anything that you're going to see in game. Okay, so we just kind of covered the rest of those, went over that. So I talked about this. I talked about the hotkeys over there. There's your F to frame a mesh, right? Rotating your lighting, and then of course, your channel view, your material view. Okay, I did go into the edit settings. We covered that. Your 2D view has the same kind of things. Oh, and by the way, which I didn't show, and this could be fairly useful, is your export to Photoshop tool. So when you're in here, of course, if you want to paint here, if you just feel like for some reason you're just not getting that same feel and you want to be able to paint in Photoshop, you can easily just click over here and click on export to Photoshop, and then what do you want to export? So you'll actually see that it'll show you all of these. Let's just for, like time's sake, to make it so it doesn't take that long, I'm going to shut off all these different texture sets and only have it load up this, and then you can have each one. Let's just say I only want the base color. So I'll hide all of those, and we'll just hit OK, and what it's going to do is it's going to export it straight to Photoshop with all of the layers intact, so all this stuff. Now, of course, Photoshop doesn't have the same settings as Painter, so you can't adjust them in the same way, but the layers and their blends, and if they're especially, you can see it right here, it's all kind of popping in Photoshop, and there's all of the layers, so the masks and all that stuff are in there. You can turn layers on and off, right? There's my blood layer. You kind of turn that on and off, and you'll see it get affected. So for some reason, you're kind of done with it, and you like what's going on, and you want to go in and clean it up. And this is a massive image, as you can tell here. I mean, we're at 1:1 right about here. So if I double click, there's your 1:1, right? So this is a really large image. But like I said, you can paint directly in Photoshop if you feel like you have better tools there or something you want to do there. And then finally save it out, as whatever format you need, and then import that into like I said, into your 3D program of choice. You can even re-import it by saving out a file and then bringing it back into Painter. But usually I would assume that if you're going to go into Photoshop, that's after you've done everything you could within Painter first. Okay, so that is kind of a useful little button also in the corner there. Like I said, there's just a lot of content I want to cover, so I want to make sure that I got it all for you guys. But yeah, we talked about our texture sets, right? How we can turn things on and off, how you want to name your materials, and the display settings, right? We talked about you can bake your textures, add or remove your channels and so on. Display settings, so we talked about the camera options. Things like that. Like I said, it's only affecting the view but not your textures, and then your viewer settings and so on. So yeah, there you go. I think we covered everything. Hopefully this video is helpful for you guys, and we'll cover some more information in the future videos. So I'll see you in the next one.